Welcome to the jointly hosted SAFE MSDI symposium. This is very exciting for us because MSDI and SAFE, this is our first jointly hosted symposium. And I was saying to Sharon earlier that I think combining the energy and passion of SAFE and MSDI in terms of having a positive impact on the sustainability of our environment, we're a bit of a formidable force. So this is pretty exciting. But yes, I'd like to start by recognizing that the Australian campuses of Monash University lie on the unceded lands of the peoples of the Kulin Nations, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present. So we're going to be having a conversation today about looking inside the black box of publishing, and I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Catherine Tait, who's the scientific editor for One Earth. And we're really looking forward to what she has to say. But before that, I thought I'd just quickly remind everybody who we are and why we are here, and why the synergy with One Earth is actually quite interesting. So SAFE is an interdisciplinary program. The Australian Research Council Special Research Initiative, Securing Antarctica's Environmental Future, has three broad themes across climate processes and climate change, biodiversity status and trends, and also environmental stewardship. Whereas MSDI is renowned for its very influential work on advancing sustainable development in Australia and in the region. And One Earth is focused on, as I understand and know, breaking down the barriers between the sciences and the humanities. And so we share quite a common vision and mission. And so I think the debates and the questions and the discussions over the rest of today is going to be very interesting and fruitful. So with that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Catherine. So Catherine has a PhD in ecology from Colorado State University, where she looked at differences in ecology, differences in how ecology shape cognitive and behavioral variation in bees. And she did her postdoctoral research at the Center for Animal Cognition at the University Paul Sabatier, where she looked at the interaction of global climate change biology and pollination ecology. And she's now scientific editor for One Earth, which is Cell Press's flagship sustainability science journal. And this journal is interested in the intersection of conservation biology, resource availability, and land use. Now we're going to hear a little bit more about the publishing and editorial process. So handing over to you, Catherine. Thanks. Can everyone hear me?
We good? Okay, cool. Wow, that was a great introduction. That kind of eats up two of my first slides, actually. No, it's fine. So really quickly, just for like the structure of this presentation, there's a few ways I can do it. I do have slides, and I'm more than happy to just lecture. I do love to talk. Alternatively, we can make this more of a discussion, more of sort of a workshop where if you have questions at any point in time, you can ask. I know that certain people might want certain information about publishing, depending on where you are in your publishing career or where you are in your research career. So I'm open to questions at any time if you want, or happy to just lecture indefinitely. That's also something that I do. So anyway, publishing science, the editor's perspective. So quick, I guess, background on an editor, which was partially covered. I do have a bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan in ecology and evolutionary biology. I studied paper wasps during my undergrad, and then I thought that I absolutely hated insects, so I decided to chase monkeys around the Amazon rainforest for a year. It turns out that I do not like monkeys. I moved back to social insects, honeybees, at Colorado State University, where I was doing my PhD. Then I did a postdoc on bumblebees and honeybees and how metabolic ecology influences their development. And after about 2 years of that, I decided that I wasn't really excited about doing research, didn't like getting stung that much anymore. So I transitioned into a career as a science reader, writer, as an editor at Cell Press, which is what brings me to you guys today. So a quick little shout out for my journal, which also I got a great little introduction on this. One Earth is Cell Press's flagship sustainability science journal. We publish research that offers a significant conceptual advance. We're particularly interested in cross-disciplinary research, which I understand is a big proponent of the research going on here. So I'm really interested to hear what you guys work on. We like studies that have global implications, multi-regional, multi-country, also research that has strong policy implications. It's really nice to see sustainability science and research transition into actionable change. We're very interested in that at One Earth. And we also like to curate monthly thematic issues. This is probably the best and worst part of my job. Every month, the editorial team decides on a topic that we're really interested in within the field of sustainability science. It's highly variable depending on which editor is leading the issue. Myself, I handle everything related to biodiversity conservation, land use change, and food security. But we have editors that work on green energy transitions, on human behavior as it relates to sustainability, atmospheric science, geological sciences. So we have quite a broad swath of topics. But we like to curate opinion pieces, research, reviews, perspectives on one topic and present them sort of as a thematic issue. These issues also get a little bit of a press release, and we try to publicize them as much as possible. The rest of the 2025 lineup, we're looking at biofuels, permafrost, conflict, croplands, sustainable polymers, and coral reef restoration. If you're working on anything in these areas and you don't think it'll be ready in time for one of these issues, that's fine. We're always interested in this research, but we do like to try and bring it together in one package and push it out once a month. But I'm happy to talk about thematic issues more. And as we're still trying to figure out our 2026 lineup, I would love to hear what you guys think is important sustainability science research or what you'd like to see more of in the publishing sphere. So open to comments and questions. But on to what I'm really here to talk about. Publishing science from the editorials or from the editor's perspective. So I'll just discuss a little bit about what editors look for when we're handling papers, how we handle papers, and also any, I guess, tips and tricks or advice for how to get your paper from my desk out to reviewers as efficiently and easily as possible for you. So, right, the publication process, the editorial process. The thing I'll say about this, aside from that, we present it as linear. We know it's not a linear process. Is that from the editor's perspective, our goal is to make this as smooth as possible for the authors. So the last thing I think any researcher wants is to have their research sit on the editor's desk for weeks at a time. So whenever editors are kind of working and making decisions, we do try to prioritize your time. We don't want to waste it with sort of cyclical review processes or cyclical conferences between editors about whether or not a paper should go out to review or not. And that I hope will kind of come out as I talk a little bit more about how we make decisions about your research. But the first step, submitting your article. So the advice I always give authors when it comes to where you should submit your article, how to get your article or how to get your research out to review is make sure that your research aligns with the journal scope. And I know that that can be a really frustrating term. What is journal scope? What is scope? What is not scope? I think every journal talks about it. What is scope? I like to think that a journal scope breaks down into three things. It's the novelty of the research they're publishing, how significant is the advance over the current body of literature, and then who is the audience of that journal? Who reads that journal, who cites that journal, that's going to be the audience and that's going to be the scope. A very quick, short example from my very brief time as a researcher, maybe a toy example. This paper, inter-individual variation in the use of social information during learning in honeybees, right? Where does this research belong? Who is the audience? What is the scope? So it was in honeybees. So definitely we could have selected a research journal specifically for honeybees, like Apidology. We could also have looked at something like an insect science journal. It would fit there. Because this research was focused on the use of social information and learning, we probably could have aimed for something like animal behavior or cognition. But because we formulated the narrative in terms of evolution of these traits, we thought we could probably push it into an even broader science journal, which is actually where we ended up submitting it to proceedings. So that is how I like to think about where to put your research. It's not necessarily the most impactful journal. It's who's going to read your research and who's going to cite it. Because at the end of the day, that's what you as researchers want, right? You want your papers being read and cited. So aim for the journal that has the audience for your research. Once the research comes to me, though, now we're under this like editorial review process. So how editors handle the paper when it initially comes to the desk is that we do essentially a literature survey. We read your research, all of it, abstract, introduction, methods, results, discussion, and then we go and we look at the current body of literature as it relates to your research, and we try and orient your research in that field and determine what is the research gap? How do your results address that gap? How novel is your approach? How novel is the question you're asking? We also try to figure out how important is that research gap? Who is going to be interested in reading about that? That kind of gets at the audience. And finally, we try to determine if there are any aspects of the paper that might get in the way of peer review. This mostly just comes down to really simple revisions. Maybe there's some language issues. One of the biggest complaints I see is no line numbers. We'll send it back immediately if there's no line numbers because reviewers get really mad. I had someone once tell me that figures need to be colorblind appropriate. So these are all things that at the very end, when we've decided we're going to send your paper out to review, what are some tweaks you might be able to do to just make this an even smoother process before we send it to reviewers? Um, Right, out to peer review, everyone, I guess, favorite part of this process. So when we are sending manuscripts out to review, as editors, we can't be experts in everything. And so what we prioritize is making sure to get every technical component of your paper reviewed by an expert. If there are particular models you're using, analyses you're using, if you're working in a specific model organism or a geographical region, we have to make sure that we get an expert in that area to assess the quality of your research. Interdisciplinary papers tend to take more time, often because we need experts from various fields. We check to make sure there are no conflicts of interest. We have software that kind of checks to make sure that if you suggest someone or we find someone and you've published with them in the last 5 years, we can kind of weed them out early on. And I would say that this process is taking an increasingly long time for anyone that's currently sent a paper out to review. And this is in part due to reviewers yourselves are very busy, but also because research is becoming more interdisciplinary and it's requiring more expertise. I will say that from my perspective as an editor, at One Earth, we don't send a lot of research out to review. I think 25% of the papers I receive end up going out to review. So I'm very attached to the research that I send out. I'll say that. If I send something out to review, I'm really excited by it. I think it's cool. I think it's going to be really impactful. And so I try to make sure that we line up the best possible reviewers for your paper who give you the most useful and constructive feedback. Um, I guess an example of how we approach this review process. This is one of the first papers I ever got to handle that went all the way out to publication at One Earth. And this was Insights from Citizen Science Reveal Priority Areas for Conserving Biodiversity in Bangladesh. So when we were trying to line up reviewers, we had to make sure to get someone or multiple people with expertise in the use of citizen science as it applies to designing priority areas and protected areas, people who use citizen science in conservation biology, and finally, because the study took place in Bangladesh, we needed to make sure that we got an expert who works in Bangladesh to comment on the reliability of the data, the analysis, and the actual application of it. So that was kind of just a quick example of how we think about soliciting reviews. Right. The editorial, the editorial evaluation. So I will start this by saying that once the reviews come back in, it's not just a vote. It's not that two said no and one said yes. So it's a no from us. Once the reviewer reports come in, the editor reads all the reports. We determine at that stage if, one review is essentially useless, if it's not providing anything constructive, or if it's mean or biased, we reject that review and we find a new reviewer. So we'll do that at that stage. But assuming that all the reviews are appropriate, we read them, we analyze them, we determine what the key concerns of the reviewers are. We write up a report. From my perspective, I've already said that I'm really excited about the research I send out to review. So I like to approach the decision not so much as who said no and who said yes versus how easily or how possible is it for the reviewer or the authors to address the reviewer comments. If it's possible to address the comments in a given time frame, normally 4 to 5 months, it might be more of a major revisions decision versus if we think that you're going to need more data, you're going to need more analyses, it's going to take 6 months or beyond, it might be a reject and resubmit decision. But ultimately, I approach reviews as, can you address it? If so, how long will it take? And that's kind of how we make decisions on reviewer assessments. Of course, if there are serious technical concerns, we have to consider rejecting the paper. If there are concerns about novelty or significance of advance, if something's been published similar recently, then we also do have to take that into account and potentially recommend reject or recommend submitting to a different journal. But that's how I think about the peer review process. Um, and now the paper goes back to you for revisions. The first thing that I always recommend authors to do is to read the comments and then just take a moment and pause. I understand as someone who used to publish, it's really easy to be quite passionate about your research and feel that the reviewers didn't understand what you did or they didn't give you a fair shake. That's totally possible. So I always encourage the authors to consider, can and should every component of the reviewer's assessment be implemented? It doesn't always have to be. If you feel that you've done the right thing and the reviewer has kind of missed the mark, you can just defend your research, defend your position in a response. You don't have to make every change the reviewers recommend. But explain, if you're not going to do that, why not? And it helps to always point to previous literature and explain why maybe your approach is correct. Make it clear, in point by point responses, referencing specific line numbers, how you've addressed the comments. And also just from my perspective, even though the paper is back with you, I'm still your handling editor. So if you have any concerns or comments or questions about the reviews, you can always reach out to me. Part of my job is to serve as a liaison between you and your reviewers. So if you don't understand something the reviewer asked for, feel free to email me and I can reach out to the reviewer and get additional clarity for you. If you're not sure that one of the revisions you've made is going to address that reviewer response appropriately, reach out to me. I'm happy to once again look at that and help come to a decision. I'm always kind of in the background, just trying to get your paper back to review in in as efficiently a manner as possible. So finally, we'll kind of like wrap it up here for the moment. The paper often goes back to review, but as we know, this process isn't linear. The next step might be publication, it might be major revisions, it might be rejection and transfer to a different journal. It's quite a long and cyclical process. I will just point out that, every stage of this process depends on people and people do make mistakes. Appeals are part of the process, and we're very open to the appeal process at One Earth. The last thing I want to do as an editor is miss out on really cool, transformative science. So if you feel that we've made an incorrect decision at some point, reach out to us. If your research really is as impactful as like you believe it is, and the reviewers have made the wrong decision, let us know. I want to publish good science. That's my only goal right now. So reach out. Let us know. Appeal processes, they take a little bit longer. They're a little more complex, but we do encourage them and we're open to them. And then if it goes on to publication, just some from the editors, again, from the editor's perspective, we have a few things that we can kind of do at the end. Editors will often provide support for the scientific narrative. One Earth is a very broad, we have a broad audience. So oftentimes we'll work with our authors to make sure that the narrative is accessible to a broad audience, that it is going to be easily readable for maybe non-experts in your field. We have a production team that handles grammar. One Earth is a hybrid journal, so you do have a choice between publishing with a subscription or open access. And we also occasionally do press releases. So if we think that some research is going to be like really exciting for the non-scientific community, we pitch this to our press release team, and they will forward this on to appropriate news outlets to see if it gets picked up. So that's always exciting when we get to see research in something like The Guardian. Okay, I guess I can pause right here and I can answer questions. I know I just kind of gave you a lot of information really rapidly about publishing, but I can pause and answer any questions if there are any. Yes.
Thank you for the insightful, really interesting to hear. I was actually curious to hear more about how you find the right peer reviewers. Yeah, I would be curious to hear from behind the scene how that happens.
Yeah, it involves a little bit of stalking, is kind of how I like to put it, as nice as possible. So I'll go through the list of citations to see what's been cited in the paper. Obviously, if it's been cited in the paper, it's probably going to be relevant. So I might shortlist authors from that. Authors often recommend reviewers. That's more hit or miss. Normally, what I'll do is go to those authors and then see if they have any collaborators that might be appropriate. Occasionally, the recommended reviewer is the best possible choice, in which case we might go with them. But we do try to, ensure there are no conflicts of interest. But it can be complicated at times because, again, some papers have a really specific expertise, and maybe there's only a few people in the community that are working on that research, so we have to select from that pool. But mostly it just involves a lot of like searching relevant literature to figure out who is the appropriate reviewer. Yeah.
There is one question online that is asking, do you have any tips for writing a cover letter to the editor?
I do, and I actually have a whole slide on it.
Oh, excellent.
And I've got a cover letter example that I've written that I'm happy to share with anyone who wants it. I kind of wrote one up for my own research. So if you want that, like email me afterward. I'm like, everyone can have that and copy it. But yes, I do have cover letter advice. Yeah.
There is also one raised hand online. Jenny, do you want to go ahead? I hope we can hear you.
Hi, yeah, can
Yes,
you
I do.
hear me?
Yes.
Oh, well, it's so wonderful to have you here, Catherine, and thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I actually have so many questions, but I'll just pick one to begin with, and we'll see if I can come back to some of the others. Just right back at the beginning, you were talking about journal choice, and giving an example of all the different ways that you could cut your research into which type of journal. I was just really interested to hear you mention picking a journal based on the journal audience in terms of who would read that journal and therefore your article rather than something like impact. Maybe I'm a bit unique or not. I didn't think so, but as an interdisciplinary researcher, I don't follow journals because there would be so many journals that I would have to keep track of. So I basically use, Google Scholar and databases and AI research tools even sometimes now to find, articles relevant to the topics that I'm doing. And so I was wondering, do you see that idea of like having a journal having a particular audience who follows it as being relevant into the future? Because I guess I typically tend to use impact as a proxy for the quality of the process that I'm about to go through with the editor and the reviewers, and hopefully the quality of review and feedback that I'll get as a way of picking a journal, because I wouldn't know where other interdisciplinary researchers would be reading because it's such a plethora of places, and as you said, the amount of time to follow. So yeah, just interested in your reflections on that.
Yeah. No, that's it probably sounds funny coming from an editor who, manages a journal or helps manage a journal, but absolutely, that impact factor isn't always the most important thing when you're selecting your journal. Again, as a researcher, I think the most important thing for you is to get your research read and cited, because that will influence your research potential and your research reputation. So while impact factor of a journal can be an indicator potentially of the quality of the research, it isn't like a hard and fast metric, right? It's not the higher the impact factor, the better the science being published there. It might be an indicator of just how widely that research gets cited. I think some of the most some of the highest impact journals are like medical science, right? So this is just because it's getting cited like that research gets cited very, very frequently. So yes, I encourage authors to focus on who their audience is and where that research is being published, not so much, what is the reputation of the journal. And I guess that does sound funny coming from someone whose job is, partly what is the reputation of One Earth? But yeah, I do encourage authors to think about scope and audience. Also because, when we make the decision on research to send it out to review or not send it out to review, it's always about our audience. Even if like a topic sounds really cool, if it's a total miss for our audience, I can't really send it out to review. It wouldn't make sense for me to send something out to review that's not going to be cited by our audience. So I always think audience is a primary metric.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Maybe one of the things that we need to work on is working out where our audience is actually reading, because that's the bit that stumps me. If I have no idea, where they would be reading. I don't know if other people have similar. I do have a ton more questions, but they can wait to other times if other people have questions.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks, Jenny. We'll see if there are more questions, otherwise we can come back to you.
Or maybe I'd also have another question.
Go ahead.
So much in your job is about so much reading, summarizing, trying to select things. I was wondering, is anywhere in your workflow AI starting to play a bigger role and actually kind of a useful tool? Or this is nothing that, I don't know, the editorial community discusses about using much at the moment?
For my normal workday, I don't find it very useful just because, the most it could possibly do is summarize a paper for me, but I still have to read your paper to figure out whether it's a good fit or not and figure out who to be inviting for reviewers. So from my perspective of my actual job, no, I do not find AI to be particularly useful. It is an ongoing discussion, I think, at all the big publishing houses, just because I think that AI could be a very useful tool for researchers. This has, great potential for authors who English isn't their first language and they need to translate their paper. That'll be really important, I think, going forward, as opposed to, paying for a professional translator. But on the whole, no, we don't really. I think our bigger concern right now is just making sure that people aren't using AI to write their entire manuscript. Or potentially, I've heard that there's concern that reviewers are using AI to generate reviews. I can say with some confidence that I haven't seen a review yet that was generated by AI. It's kind of fun. I got a review just a few days ago where someone started by saying, "I'm sorry, I'm so grumpy." So there's certainly like a human component to a lot of the reviews we receive. A lot of the cover letters, a lot of the correspondence from the authors, we can kind of see that we're dealing with a person, not a computer. But maybe AI will outpace us, and then we'll have to figure out our own AI to identify it. But it is an ongoing conversation. I think once a month, the editors are like, okay, what are we going to do about this? So, yeah.
There was a comment online about whether AI can actually help with finding peer reviewers.
That yes and no. So me and one of my coworkers decided that we were going to see if we could use it. We were going to test it against like whether it was as effective for us or whether it was effective as we are at finding reviewers. And it will generate names. The time that we did it, it generated about 4 names of dead people. So that's something that we can only assess by, so part of the stalking process is that I go to like each researcher's webpage and see like what they're working on, and I look at their recent publication history. So I guess like maybe it could shortlist people for me, but I still have to go and double check that these are the appropriate people, that they're alive, that they're not retired. So it could make like it could probably generate a list really quickly, but you still have to do the back checking. Yeah. Yeah.
Can I ask a question regarding data using paper? Because sometimes the data using paper could be really old due to all kinds of reasons, maybe have submitted previously several times, and also maybe literature review. So would that be a problem if the data would be like 1 year ago or even like 2 years?
I don't think year-old data is necessarily a problem. I'm just thinking of this from my perspective as an ex-researcher. We worked on like a yearly cycle where we collected data in the summer, and it didn't like, we ended that process a year later of like writing the paper, analyzing everything. So I don't know that like a year-old data is problematic. If, however, you're working in a system where data is being generated rapidly and it's readily available, then reviewers might comment on that. I've had that happen where someone used data that was like 2 or 3 years old. They downloaded it from a server, and one of the reviewers had commented like, well, we've already updated this data. And I understand where that can be kind of problematic because it takes time to write a paper and it takes time to analyze data. So in that instance, I actually ended up getting an arbitrating reviewer to just comment on whether or not it was appropriate to use that data. And they did say in the end, like, it's fine. The data is slightly out of date, but were the results significantly different? No. So that's how we kind of approach, I guess, a data problem. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, it's on.
Okay, that's what you were saying. Okay. Okay. Hi again. I have a question about the audience. You spoke about the importance of thinking about what the audience is, and I wonder, like, to what extent, like, my audience as a research is aligned to the audience of a journal. And I mean, my audience is other scientists or governments or companies or maybe these kind of stakeholders, right? But journals, like the subscription of the journals, which is actually my question, I assume it's not paid by individuals. Like I don't pay any subscription. Monash does it for me. So I wonder, yeah, what is the actual audience of a journal, and to what extent is it aligned to my audience? And should I think about my audience or your audience or both, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Try to think about both because I mean it's better for you to consider who your audience is and who the journal's audience is. Because if you submit a paper to me and it's not the right audience, I'm going to reject it and you've wasted like 7 days, right? If it goes out to review and gets published in a journal with people who aren't necessarily going to cite your research, it's great that it's published, but it's not getting the attention it deserves. So I always encourage authors to think about who wants to read it and cite it. One way to check that is to look at what papers have been published recently in that journal, and also look at your citation list and see where your citations are coming from. That should be an indicator maybe of where you should be aiming, and who you should be thinking about sending that paper to. Yeah. Journals also might have sort of, I don't think there's any hard and fast metric for like, if it's not a global study, they don't want it. But journals that have a really broad readership often encourage larger scale studies just because they want to make it applicable to as many people as possible in their readership. So say that's only done in North America might not matter as much to someone who's working in Australia. So you might want to consider that when you think about your audience as well. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yes, I wonder, absolutely. I also wonder, like, if it's the journal's audience, is it typically universities or who else, like, who gets subscriptions?
Yeah. So I can only really comment on One Earth because I've only ever worked for One Earth. I know that while our audience is predominantly researchers, we're really happy that I think it's something like 30% of our documents get cited in policy literature. So we do, um, we like to think at least that policymakers do read some of our work. So we do encourage that audience as well at One Earth.
Okay,
I don't know about.
universities and governments. Okay.
Yeah,
Makes-
yeah.
makes
So
sense.
we prioritize universities and governments. Some journals might be very specific, university researchers.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
sounds good.
Mhm.
Kind of jumping off of that, when you say that policies are like policymakers are reading your documents, are they reading the journal or are they reading like the thematic ones? Like, is it that they're building a policy document on something like biofuels and they're like, great, there's a whole journal volume on this?
I don't have the stats on what specifically they're reading. I assume it's the specific articles, not necessarily the thematic issues. It'd be great if they are, because we do publicize the thematic issues and we try to get as much attention for those as possible. But we also do small social media campaigns for all the research that we publish. Every month when we publish something, we put something up on social media about like, look at this new paper. Here's a really impactful figure. Here's the major findings. Here are the people that did it. So, I mean, I like to think that they're, finding the specific articles they like and they're like citing them and reading them. But maybe it's the thematic issues. That might just be a different way of getting more attention.
On that question, Catherine, can I ask a follow-up? Can you, as an editor, also talk about the importance of keywords and titles for articles because of exactly the same reason, being found more easily?
Yeah.
I think it also goes back to Jenny's question at the start, because a bit like her, I also don't necessarily follow journals. I follow some researchers that I know doing really good work in the area that I'm working. And then also I just use keywords to search for articles rather than necessarily following journals. So do you have any tips or recommendations for how we should find these keywords, how we should write titles to attract attention and readership?
Yeah. For titles, at One Earth, we encourage authors to name your paper after your big headline finding, not so much what you did. So we always ask authors to think like, if a newspaper was going to publish your research, what's going to be that big, impactful, catchy finding that you want to leave a broad audience with? So always, or at least, I mean, I guess some journals might have a different preference. Our suggestion is always, what is your big headline finding, and make that your title. What do you want to leave just a reader with? And that's something I talk about later. But also from a reviewer perspective, consider that reviewers only see your title and your abstract. And so when you're trying to convince someone to review your paper, that's all they're going to see. So you don't want your title to be this kind of like really complicated, over wordy. What we did so much. What did you find? What's the big headline finding? In terms of keywords, that's one I don't think about a lot. I guess my best advice would be and it's probably very intuitive. Who are the researchers you want reading it? So if you're doing work on honeybee cognition, neurobiology would be a key term, or in my case, energetics or neurohormones. So I guess always keep your audience in mind when you're selecting your keywords, since it should be fairly similar. If you're following this person and your research is similar to theirs, it should be fairly similar. But keywords are a bit harder. That one I don't know.
I think we don't want to miss out on hearing about your tips and tricks for impactful science. And I think there'll be time for questions afterwards as well. So
Yeah,
would you like to? Yeah.
I'm happy to move on and take more questions later. So these are just some thoughts that I think the editorial team has put together on what we view as the most efficient way of getting research from us back to review. So we've talked about this, I think, like at length, but the trick is like to convince the editor. By the end of the cover letter, abstract, and introduction, I should know why the subject is important within the scope of the journal. So why does our audience care about it? what is the knowledge gap? In what field does it exist? What is the context of the existing knowledge? Why is it important to address that knowledge gap? That also gets at the audience again. Who is going to care about that knowledge gap and who is going to care about that knowledge being addressed? Point to the existing literature is our recommendation. Key methods are useful, and this is more just from a selfish standpoint as an editor. If I know your methods, I know who to invite in terms of reviewers. It also does give me an indication of who your audience might be. And then headline findings. What is that big, impactful result that you want to leave the community with? The cover letter. I promised it was coming. My advice is that no cover letter is bad, but some are useless. And what I mean by that is that I'm going to read your abstract. I'm going to read the introduction. I'm going to read everything. So if you just replicate your abstract into the cover letter, it's not bad, but it doesn't tell me anything. It doesn't say anything new. And I encourage authors to leverage each component of your submission to say something different or inform a different audience. And quickly, this slide is hideous. And like I said, I will share my cover letter with anyone who wants it. So my apologies in advance. But this is my general advice for how to approach a cover letter. Keep in mind that they don't have to be formulaic. Abstracts, introductions, science writing in general is really structured, and we have a specific way that we want to present information. Your cover letter actually doesn't have to be. It can be incredibly informal. I've never rejected a paper because the cover letter was written in a more casual language. Never. So it can be. I just recommend 4 sections, 4 paragraphs. The first one is kind of like the abstract. Think of it as a reduced abstract. What are the background methods and results? Key introduction there. Next paragraph, what is the knowledge gap? And I recommend just using this language. Some previous literature has explored, insert what that is. However, no study has examined what have you done? How have you addressed it? And then pair that with, this is an important knowledge gap for 3 reasons, and then explain just what are those reasons. On that, I would recommend that if you've done some sort of novel methodology or some sort of novel analysis, include it in there. One Earth isn't particularly a methods journal, but novel methods do get lots of citations. So we like to know about that if you're doing a novel method. Additionally, it also signifies to us that we're probably going to have to find an expert with similar knowledge to analyze those methods for us. Another paragraph on the significance of the advance. This paper is significant because. That's sort of where you contextualize your results. So the results in the first paragraph, once you're there, kind of put that into the broader literature, orient it in the broader literature. And then who the audience is, always back to audience, always back to scope. The results of this research will be of interest to researchers in, and then just list out the fields, whoever it is. Maybe it's conservation biologists, maybe it's policymakers, maybe it's neurobiologists, maybe it's honeybee researchers. Just explicitly say who will be interested in it. And then, especially if the journal has recently published on the topic, if you've recently published on the topic in the journal and you want to reference your own paper, or if someone else has recently published on the topic in the journal, reference it there. Because as editors, we're constantly thinking, is this a good fit for us? If we published something 6 months ago on this topic, there's a good chance it's a good fit for us. So we also just go to that piece of literature and compare it. So that's my advice for kind of how to structure a cover letter. Right. I think we talked on this a little bit as well. The title is your hook. And reviewers only see the title in the abstract. That's the only thing that when it comes time to make a decision, yes or no, that's what they're going to look at. So you really want to make sure that your title is impactful and it leaves the reviewer, the reader, with some sort of lasting memory. And the abstract, which I'll get to in a moment, on how to structure that, should be formulated in a way that really draws attention in and keeps it. And that's kind of how we recommend doing it right now. So One Earth, our abstracts are pretty short and it varies by journal. Ours are 150 words max. So it really forces you to kind of succinctly write up your research. So 4 kind of broad ways of approaching it. First, we recommend a broad introductory statement of why this is important. In this case, insects are, prevalent all over the globe, but their populations are declining, and we're going to need a huge effort to reverse these declines. The knowledge gap in this case is that coverage of insect representation across protected areas is very limited. Then approach sort of the broader context of the research. So in this case, it's people who design protected areas, broadly protected area design, and then also the geographic interest of this. Their results demonstrate that North America, Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and Australia have lower coverage. So this kind of indicates who the geographical context of interest is as well. I would say 1 sentence, 2 max, that describe what you did and what your results were. Very, again, succinct. You might have a lot of results in your research, but what is your, again, key headline finding? What is that big result that you really want that summarizes your work? Put it in the abstract. And then finally, close with an indication of broader interest. Who broadly is this who would be interested in this? Just as a note, editors, we work pretty closely with our authors on their abstracts. So if your abstract comes in to One Earth and it's not formulated like this, that's okay. We'll still, if it's still of interest, if it's still the right audience, if it's still good, interesting, novel research, we'll send it out to review. Before we publish it, we do a lot of editorial work. So I'll generally give detailed feedback on how to clean up an abstract. So this isn't necessarily like a hard rule. We won't accept it if you don't structure like this. But we will ask for some revisions before we accept it. So that's kind of the abstract. And finally, this is also probably intuitive since you guys are the readers of science, you are the reviewers of science. Good science is essentially good storytelling. You want to make sure that when you formulate your introduction, it really catches the attention of the audience. It builds up a sort of tension or excitement. It creates a sense of urgency in the readers. They want to read your introduction and then think to themselves, wow, we need an answer to the problem that you've just addressed. And then look, you've presented the answer for them immediately afterward. My advice on discussions as well is just to really clearly articulate the meaning of your results. So oftentimes, if it's not very explicitly told to the reader might draw their own conclusions about your research, and this will just lead to miscommunication, and you'll end up doing more revisions to your discussion. So I always recommend on the discussion, be very clear, be very explicit. Don't leave anything to the reviewer's interpretation. Make sure that what you want the reviewer to take home is what you've told them about your data and about your results. And finally, readers, you guys are very busy, whether you're, researching, teaching, mentoring, writing, you have a lot of demands on your time. So when you're constructing your manuscript, think that, readers are quite busy people, and what do you want to leave them with in your research? So I think I managed to get through this in a timely fashion. I'm told that the LinkedIn and the Blue Sky QR codes work now. They'll take you to One Earth's page. Additionally, that's my email, and then that's the One Earth email. I'm happy to answer more questions on any of these topics and anything else that you guys have questions on in terms of publishing or editorial work or anything.
Thanks so much, Catherine. I think we have some time for questions. So any more questions? I have one in the meantime. So with your special issues or your thematic issues, do you collate work on that topic yourself, or do you rely on sort of a research editor to pull the set of papers together?
It's a mix. So when we decide on the topic, we will solicit commission pieces. So we like to have at least one long piece, a review or a perspective, commentaries that touch on specific components of it. We also do voices, which are these short opinion pieces. And then we have maybe like a resource or a primer, some technical document. Those are all things that we will invite. And we do, because reviews take time. We invite about a year out for some of our topics. However, if research comes in that we think is topical and we think it aligns with that issue and it's timely, we will ask the authors, do you want to, if the paper gets accepted, that is, we'll ask the authors, do you want to maybe forego publication by a month or two so that we can present it with all of this other content on the topic? But that sort of stuff is just if timing is right and we get the research, then we can try and line it up with the issues.
Thanks, Catherine. That was really helpful. I'm curious if you have any tips on specifically publishing review papers, and if you think it's ever worth reaching out to editors in advance to sort of pitch it before you go ahead and, you know, create the whole narrative, or yeah.
So the short answer is always reach out to the editor. So each journal might have specific kind of forming or formulations for how they want their reviews. I know, for instance, One Earth, we actually don't do these big scoping reviews. Ours are fairly short. They're 5,000 to 6,000 words. We have a synopsis that we ask all authors to fill out so that we can provide early guidance on how to shape the narrative. And from the author's perspective, the last thing you want to do is like spend a bunch of time writing a review and then be told like, oh no, you have to change all of this. So I always recommend with any long piece review perspective, reach out to the editors. We love pre-submissions. We love having these conversations because it saves everyone time. So definitely reach out. Mhm.
Yeah, along a similar line, for like non-review articles, just standard, I was wondering, like, journals often have like a style guide, or particularly with figures as well. How important is it for like an initial submission to meet kind of like do you look at a paper and I guess think about whether it aligns really closely with what your journal style guide is, or if people have like submitted it obviously clearly somewhere else and then submitted it to you or something like that, does that matter in terms of a judgment for the initial manuscript submission?
No. The short answer is no. The long answer is that it will potentially hold up your own research if, let's say, it goes through and is ready to be accepted. We will require procedural revisions to get it into shape for our journal. So I do a lot of work kind of at the end where it's like, okay, this narrative does need to be kind of fixed a little bit to make it more applicable to a broader audience. In terms of just like figures, no. I would say always have line numbers, always, or else the reviewers get really mad. But short answer is no.
There are a couple of questions online. So one is that, in your opinion, what's the best platform to collate all of our research papers? And a few suggestions: ResearchGate, University Profiles, LinkedIn, academia.eu.
Ooh. That's a tough one because I follow a lot of those different things when I'm looking for authors and when I'm trying to keep abreast of really current research. I use a lot of those platforms just to kind of follow up and see what you guys are working on. Um, I mean, I guess LinkedIn is a good place. A lot of the archives where people just put their research, that's some place that I'll go to see what's going on. And also, if there's really interesting research that hasn't been submitted yet, I might ask if they want to come submit to us. So that's something that editors will do occasionally. They'll go to like maybe bioarchives or something and like, oh, this is a really cool research paper. I see it's not submitted yet. I've definitely reached out to authors before to invite them to submit to us. Normally they've already submitted it somewhere, but they let me know that like, oh, if it gets rejected, I'll come to you next. But yeah, that's possible.
That's really cool to know. Okay. Another question online by Jenny. Jenny, feel free to unmute and ask.
Thank you. Yeah, so I just really excited to kind of get this peek behind the process. I'm a fairly early career researcher, had a few papers published, but actually all of my papers have been published in journals where it doesn't feel like the editor plays much of a direct role. So certainly doesn't ever instruct me to do anything other than what's in peer review things. I'm just interested to hear that you do actually do a lot of work for your journal to try and make sure that, you know, everything matches the way that you're done. I'm just interested in like this concept of peer review, and, you know, just obviously everybody has experiences with peer review. But it came back to this thing about, you know, how you submit your paper. A lot of the Elsevier journals now have this, you know, your article your way. So they just say submit it however you like at the beginning. And then if you get published, you get to do it. And a lot of the reviewers were coming back and telling me that it was in the wrong format and I had to change all of these things. And there was no comment from the editor saying, well, no, you don't, because our policy is X. So I was just wondering, again, peek behind the curtain. You obviously can only talk about One Earth, and that's all I'm interested in. But do you ever kind of, beyond checking, is this peer review valuable? Is it, you know, is it unbiased? Is it going to help you with your decision and the researcher with their article? Do you ever engage with the actual content and either like go back to the review and say, oh, this particular part's not appropriate, or instruct the author to ignore certain aspects of the commentary, or even just, you know, edit and remove? Like, do you ever actually engage at that level where you're looking at certain things and saying, you know, maybe that part of this review is not appropriate?
Yes. So we don't ever delete comments from the reviewers, but this topic you bring up of the formatting, that gets commented on a lot. I know at One Earth that we have our methods at the end, and a lot of reviewers don't like that. If a reviewer ever does comment that, when I send the comments to the author, I'll include in the email, we note the reviewer has recommended you do this. That does not match our journal's format. So we don't tell you to ignore it. We normally just encourage you to like make a statement to the reviewer that this is the journal's preferred formatting. So yeah, we do. If there are things that the reviewer has recommended that don't suit the journal's format or the journal's type, we do tell the authors not to make those revisions.
And do you ever do checks, like if a reviewer is recommending, you know, that the author references particular articles, do you ever go and check that those articles are not written by the reviewer?
Yes. It's nice when the reviewer says, they just admit that like, this is my research. I have that sometimes, and I prefer that when the reviewer says, full disclosure, this is my paper. I think it's really important that it be cited in this article. We do get that a lot, where the reviewers will say that, you know, this piece of literature is missing, that piece of literature is missing. We can go and check it, but what we do encourage the authors to do is, whether or not they choose to include that particular citation, explain why. So if you say that, like, I don't want to put this in there because it's just the author or the reviewer trying to get extra citations, just defend that decision not to do it. I did have one paper where the reviewer recommended adding like 10 of their own papers. And at that point, I had kind of gone through the list and I'm like, there's no way that we need to cite all of these things. And I had kind of commented to the author, I encourage you to look through this list and determine if any of these are absolutely necessary for your research. And if not, just explain why not. So that's normally how I approach, you know, recommendations for additional citations.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've had that exact thing 3 times in different things, and including by reviewers and who are not actually in my area, and so are recommending papers that are not actually relevant to my article, and with no commentary from the editor. Anyway, that's okay. One just last question. You mentioned about the recommending reviewers. Does One Earth actually require authors to specify reviewers that they recommend in submission of the article? Because that's really common in the places that I've published, where it actually asks me to name up to 3 reviewers, and I've actually spent like a couple of hours going and researching and trying to work out who would be appropriate reviewers in terms of people who are actually publishing in this area, people who will understand what I'm trying to do, you know, through this interdisciplinary research, because they've also done it, and people who have the methods or the knowledge to actually comment. And so it's just a little bit like dismaying to hear that there's might be perceptions and probably a lot of practice of people recommending reviewers with conflict of interest, and so that all those recommendations would kind of be ignored.
Yeah, so we don't require it. It's you know, you can put down your list of recommended reviewers, but it's not required for us. Part of that is because, you know, part of my job is to go and find those people, right? So it's nice when the author gives us a hint of what direction to look in, but ultimately it is my job to find reviewers for your paper. So you do not have to do that at One Earth.
Thanks. All right, we're going to take 2 last questions from the room, and then I think we'll call it a day. Richard?
Thank you very much for sharing that with us. I was going to add a question related to your audience and the review process, because given the scope of One Earth and the fact that you said that was it about a third of the citations were in policy documents, how do you kind of factor in that aspect of like the story of the storylines in these papers, of the fact that it is scientific research that's being reviewed, but it is, to some extent, the intended audience is to be implemented into policy, or it seems to be being implemented into policy. Do you ever get reviews from people who aren't, say, at universities, but are actually in the policy sector? Or is that something that you kind of manage editorially to try and help shape the storyline so it is relevant for that particular audience?
Normally when we have a reviewer that comments on policy, it's someone who works specifically in that space. They might themselves not be a policymaker, but they will be normally government researchers, someone who works with some sort of government department that feeds directly into the policy space. So that's how we try and address that. In terms of how to structure the narrative, we're pretty firm that so in your abstract, if you say that like this has policy implications for something, we tell authors explicitly, you need to discuss that. There needs to be at least one paragraph in the discussion where you explain how this research actually applies to policy, how it can be implemented. It can't just be, I think that lots of research could be like policy, it could be the basis of policy. But if your research is in this policy sphere, we need to know how and why. And oftentimes, if you don't do that, the reviewers just come back and say, okay, but what then? So we do get that comment a lot.
Yeah, I just had a question about the review process, but from like the reviewer's perspective, in that, what do you look for in like a good review? Like if I was a reviewer and I was going to review one of your papers, like what would be like an indication for you that I've done a good job, I guess?
Yeah. So the first thing I look for that is really helpful for me is just an assessment of the methods and the analysis, because we need to know. I can't be an expert in all types of analyses, and I'm certainly not an expert in all types of data, right? My data was like honeybee data during my research. So what I need to know is, are the methods robust and do they support the actual results? So that's like the first thing we need is like a technical assessment. The next thing that I'm really interested in is, I sent it out to review. So I think it's novel. I think it's significant. I think it's really cool science, for use of a better word. But do you, as the actual researcher, agree with that? Is this something that you would read and be like, wow, this is really interesting, and I think this is important for the field? So that's something that I would look for next, is just and that can be something just as simple as a statement, where I have a reviewer say, all these things need to be addressed, but this is, I think, going to be really important for the field. If it's not going to be, if maybe the novelty is compromised, then it'd be helpful to know why you think that. Maybe there's a paper that's come out recently and it's done what the authors have done, or it's done a very similar thing, or there's similar results already published. That's super useful, because it's very clear for the author then, because sometimes when authors get reviews that are kind of vague about, like, the reviewer might say, oh, this isn't that interesting, or this isn't that novel. The author obviously is like, of course it is, of course this is interesting. But if the reviewer points to a specific piece of literature, the author can, that's what I would view as constructive. The author can kind of compare their work to that and figure out, is this as novel as I thought it was, or is it in some way, shape, or form compromised in novelty? But yeah, I guess those are the two big things that I look for in a review.
Okay, one last question. Go for it.
Thank you. I was just curious about your 2 cents on opinion pieces, letters, perspectives. So not the usual research article or review. So like, how much should they still have components of a review versus actually give some novel information versus just put together a certain aspect of the literature? Yeah, if you got any thoughts on that.
I do. So the two opinion pieces, or the opinion types that we have at One Earth, are a perspective and a commentary. Perspectives they require a sort of both an analytical technical component and a review. So a perspective is a mini review of a field where you identify a specific issue, then you present a solution to it, accompanied with an example of that solution in practice. So that's a pretty technical opinion piece. It's basically opinion in the sense that you're saying, this is a problem and I have a solution. And then it's very technical in the term of, look, I've done a case study and demonstrated it. It has to be reviewed. We get at least 2 to 3 reviewers to comment on it. Commentaries are kind of like that, but minus the actual demonstration of a solution. Commentaries are often, they're shorter, they're about 2,500 words. And that is more just, it can be sort of it's often just like an identification of a specific problem and sort of it ends with advocating for a solution or advocating for more research in the area and why. It has to be pretty targeted in its narrative. That still goes out to review. It's less technical. Normally, when we have commentaries, we're asking for reviewers to comment on, is this really as important as the author is saying it is? And is this knowledge gap? Does it really urgently need to be addressed? Sort of thing. But that's for our journal. I know that some journals have much more broader kind of scoping opinion pieces that might not require such an analytical or technical component. Even our reviews, we generally ask that they have some sort of quantitative analysis in them. You've reviewed the literature and you've identified a problem, and now you're going to talk about how to resolve it. But yeah, I guess it's kind of baked into our narrative structure for longer opinion pieces. Yeah.
All right. Well, that was such a valuable discussion. Thank you so much, Catherine, for some really practical tips. I think given that this is something that occupies most of us most of the time, I think we could keep on talking about it all day. So we really appreciate you coming and your time. And yeah, so thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you to Sharon for leading the questions.